All right, good to go, Becky.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's webinar, A Decade in the Making, the Evolution of the New Development Bank, hosted by the Global China Initiative of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or GDP Center. The Boston University GDP Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability around the globe. My name is Rebecca Ray, Senior Academic Researcher at the GDP Center. When much of the world was shut down at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021, the New Development Bank, or NDB, welcomed 4 new nations into its membership: Bangladesh, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Uruguay. These additions, with Uruguay pending, were the first new members since the creation of the bank 10 years ago by its founding members, the BRICS nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Why are nations joining the NDB and the BRICS? What does the bank's growth say about its agenda and policy and its positioning with other multilateral development banks, or MDBs? To help answer these questions and more, I'm thrilled to be joined today by Gregory Chin, non-resident senior fellow with the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center and associate professor of political science and political economy at York University in Toronto, Canada. Gregory recently edited a special section of academic articles through the journal Global Policy, bringing together an interdisciplinary group of social scientists to explore the evolution and expansion of the NDB and the BRICS. The resulting collection of 10 articles examines the NDB and its role in the global financial architecture, the unique characteristics of the NDB's governance as compared with other multilateral development banks, the rationale and impacts of adding new members and increasing multipolarity, and the NDB's organizational evolution. I'll ask Greg to give us a brief overview of the project and the findings of the resulting papers, and then move to an informal conversation. Greg, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for that generous and warm introduction. It's wonderful to be with you and colleagues at the GDP Center. Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, so this collection, the special section on the evolution of the NDB, the BRICS-led New Development Bank, very happy with it. It was published during the summer with Global Policy Journal, as you kindly mentioned. And it's a collection of 10 articles which get at different angles of looking at this issue of the evolution of the New Development Bank. We have some pieces that focus on the expansion of the membership, as you nicely outlined at the start. 4 countries joining, Uruguay pending, still strange kind of story, I think largely down to domestic politics. We have 4 excellent pieces. So there's a piece on Bangladesh in the NDB, written with my PhD student candidate, actually an assistant professor, Rifat Kamal, and based on her field research in Bangladesh, where she met with officials and a bunch of participant observers and key stakeholders looking at the role of Bangladesh in NDB. But also Alvaro Mendez, who contributed on Uruguay, and then Andrew Cooper and Brendan Cannon on the United Arab Emirates, UAE. And we also have a piece on China by Professor Zhuzhe Jin at Fudan University, who looks at the question of why China supports membership expansion. So the other pieces are the individual countries. The Egypt piece is the one we struggled. We'll hope to find a contribution in the future, but that's the one piece that we're missing right now. But the others are all there, and it's very interesting to look at the shared motivations for why they are interested in joining. If you'd like, I can go into that a bit, but also obviously the differences in the national interests and how each nation fits into the regional or global scenario. But we also have pieces that look at the other dimensions of expansion of this bank. And this bank is known to have regional offices. And, in that regard, they're not unique. Others also have World Bank, for example, and IMF, they have country offices, in some cases, regional offices. But the NDB, that's one way that they have tried to build out their global footprint as well, is to have a regional presence in each of the regions that the BRICS countries essentially have influence within their regions, and to bring in others within the region into the NDB and to have relations. And also partnership arrangements. So partnerships between the NDB and other multilateral development banks and state policy banks and commercial banks and a number of differing partnerships, even some academic type partnerships and corporate. So the NDB's tried to be creative in taking a somewhat different role to partnership building, not only focusing on the other multilateral development banks, but also the state policy banks of the BRICS countries, for example, or other national development banks of its expanding membership. And then the piece also, though, based on the inspiration from the editor of Global Policy, Dr. Eva Maria Nag, she wanted us to make sure that we also put some thought to the global systemic implications, so the big picture. So try to get some views of the evolution of the NDB and what it means for the system. And so we were very happy to be able to have Jim O'Neill, some people call the father of the BRICS, to write on the evolution of the BRICS and the NDB, the growth of the NDB, kind of 20 plus years after he helped launch the idea of this grouping of the BRIC. And then also Chris Alden and Garth Lepere, who contribute a piece on the NDB within Southern diplomacy and South-South, and whether there's a kind of new diplomacy and new multilateralism of the South. So very interesting piece, because we tend to think of the NDB, certain actors, China in particular, as being kind of powerful actors behind the NDB. But the NDB also has this very interesting influence that comes from the IBSA grouping, India, Brazil, South Africa, where it was really about the development agenda, right? And so in that regard, the NDB is an influence of this kind of amalgamation of these differing, kind of visions and agendas. And it's very interesting to think that through. And the last piece, we have a culminating piece that by two former insiders, Bert Hoffman, who was a very senior World Bank economist and was the head of the resident mission in China as his last post at the World Bank, and also P.S. Srinivas. And Dr. Srinivas has worked in a number of the Washington international financial institutions, but he also worked in the president's office of the NDB, right? So he was a senior advisor and director general policy, strategic policy to KV Kamath, the former president of the NDB, the first president of the NDB. So their piece looks at, how does the NDB, as it's evolving, how does it fit into and how is it different from the so-called MDB family, the Multilateral Development Bank family? How is it similar and different from the others? This question of innovation, is it different? Is it, how so? Or to what degree, right? And so very, very sophisticated take on gauging that comparatively by those two insiders who are also scholars. Regional, just to backtrack for 1 sec, on the regional development, the regional offices, Daniel Bradlaugh and Magali Masamba, who is a GDP alumnus, right, center alumnus, so very good. They wrote an excellent piece on NDB in Africa and the African Regional Office of the NDB, because that's the office that's been established the longest and probably is so therefore a key or critical case study to look at for the regional offices, because the other regional offices in Latin America and Eurasia and South Asia, they're more recent, and the African one is the one that's been up and going since 2018. And so they look at how much progress has been made or limited progress. And then on partnership, Suresh Nanwani. Dr. Suresh Nanwani, who is a former Asian Development Bank official, who's also worked a lot with the ERDB. Suresh writes an excellent piece on partnership strategies of the NDB, and I think quite interesting. And we all kind of, one of the things, Becky, I'll wrap up very quickly, but one of the things, of course, is we started working on this in about 2021, 2022. And of course, the Ukraine-Russia conflict emerged during that period. So that's kind of also shaped the backdrop of all this, the question of sanctions and, what does it all mean? So very interesting. So sorry I went on so long, Becky.
No, that was actually perfect. Very insightful. Thank you so much for giving us this insightful introduction to the breadth of topics that are covered. You've planted so many questions I'd love to follow up with you on. And so I'll start in just the most general way, and then we can drill into some of the details that you gave us some breadcrumbs to follow. In the most general way, as we've mentioned, the NDB marks 10 years of existence as an institution or existence as an idea this year. How, in your perspective, is the NDB doing 10 years in? Some see important milestones and achievements, while others see a lack of boldness. And I'd love to hear what your position is after going through this in-depth project, looking at all of these different aspects of the growth and evolution of the institution. Thanks.
That's a great question, Becky. I think that's probably one of the most important questions, as we look at the development and evolution of this bank. I think for the first 10 years, we can say that it's basically put down all the key foundations as a new development bank or as a new multilateral development bank. And, it had to establish its credibility and legitimacy, its status, as a bank that could be respected and where the founding members, the BRICS countries, could show that they could work collectively to stand up and do something together. And I think and where they could do some new things. Therefore, the name New Development Bank. They have had to live up to their name. And I think in large degree they've established those foundations. Right? They've got projects up and going. They've been able to work out the rules and the norms, some of which they've borrowed from the other MDBs, but some things where they tend to work very, very rapidly. They try to move more quickly. They have some new norms and rules, such as working with the recipient countries' standards or borrowing country standards. And so, and they've received some criticism for that as well. Some people say, well, you're not, operating, up to global norms or standards. And then they say, well, we've consciously chosen this approach because we don't want to be just like the World Bank coming with a one-size-fits-all approach, kind of from the outside in Washington, coming into the developing world saying you must do this or that. So they're saying, they're trying to be sensitive to local country needs and context, but it's a tricky balance. But I think, they probably would wish that they had been lending more than they've been able to up until now. But this is where the bank has faced a number of challenges. And it's not just limited membership. That's, some people say, well, you only have 5 members in the NDB. Look at other banks, such as like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was open around the same time. With over 100 members, they seem to have moved more money in loans. And there's something to that. At the same time, what India, China, Brazil, these large countries could absorb huge loans if that's what they wanted to do from the NDB. So there's been a conscious decision to go at the speed that they're going at. But part of it too is the bank has been challenged by geopolitics from the beginning. Like sanctions on Russia has been a really tricky thing from to this bank in 2015, right? Because the Crimea conflict happened in 2014. US and Europe put sanctions on Russia, and the banks had to kind of duck and weave the whole time on these issues. So I think, I think we could say that the bank has done a pretty good job in kind of laying the foundation, probably a little more ambitious the first 3, 4 years, and really kind of getting up and running and try to do. And they made a pledge that something like 60 or 65% of their loans would be for renewables during that first 5, 6 year period. They now have moved back the goalpost to 30, 35%. And that's interesting. I mean, I think now their overall loan size, their book of loans is bigger now. So that 35% is bigger than the 65% before. But it kind of says, like, you wonder, what does this say? Like, how come it's 35 rather than 65? But yeah, I think so. Some people say it's not been ambitious enough, on climate change, and pushing the envelope on green and supporting more green finance and doing more innovative financing in those areas. And I think everyone is challenged in that regard. All the MDBs are facing challenges that could be doing more. So I think that, yeah, so I tend not to be as hypercritical of the bank. Part of that is, I'm not a former insider who saw all the warts, so I'm not in that position. And I didn't fight the battles on the inside in the NDB to make it, kind of do more. I do think there is the danger that it could be slipping into business as usual. I think that was starting to emerge, that it was becoming a little too much like the other MDBs and, not doing enough new. And I think that's where the appointment of Dilma Rousseff, which was somewhat controversial because people were worried about politicization of the bank. But I think Dilma has pushed the envelope. I also think it's good that it's female leading this MDB, right? I mean, this is World Bank can't claim that. So, these are yeah, Dilma has come, and she's, as per her reputation, quite ambitious and trying to push the bank to be more ambitious and to, do more new things. And I think, they're trying, local currency financing and expanding the membership of the bank and more MDB partnerships to expand the global footprint. The challenge is Dilma only has 2 years, right, in total to do it. And there's always this issue of the sanctions, right? So I think this is where the structural power, right, of the existing order, if you want to call it, or system, always, they have to kind of work around it, or through it somehow. So yeah, so I'm you can hear probably, Becky, that I'm somewhat sympathetic to this bank.
I do hear that, and I find it particularly interesting that as you acknowledge slow movement towards goals, they could expand more quickly in terms of the amount of money going out the door than they have, and yet they're still attracting new members. And
Yes.
this is really the paradox for those of us who are of the economic persuasion to see a bank that's limited in the amount of money it can push out the door, in part because of sanctions, and yet still attracting new members who understand either there are other benefits to joining the bank or that it's worth it regardless of that cost. And so I'd love to hear from you. You mentioned in your introductory remarks uh,
Mhm.
that you might be able to talk a little bit more about kind of shared motivation among some of these new entrants, these new members. What does that tell us about their motivation to join the bank? That it's not the fastest at moving huge quantities of money out the door, in part because it is limited by sanctions, which impact the amount of money it can raise on the bond market. And yet, these new members show that something is quite attractive about this bank. So I'd love to hear more about that, if you wouldn't mind, as a follow-up to that first question. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's so interesting. So the countries that are joining traditionally, so the NDB, they think of themselves as the multilateral development bank of emerging market economies, right, and developing countries. But not so much, it doesn't like not so much the small, least developed kind of, it's more the emerging, right? The BRICs and comparables. Now, UAE is interesting that way because you can say, well, it's not that big, but it's a developed country, right? So it's a non-borrowing member. It's everyone else is joining as a borrowing member. They both contribute and borrow, whereas UAE is only contributing and not borrowing, right? And that's been important for the bank and so on. So that UAE is kind of somewhat different that way. But the rest of them, yeah, it's very interesting. It's like, and there's a lot of pressure these days, as you know, Becky, with the rising geopolitical tensions, US-China tensions, and G7 Western tensions vis-a-vis the BRICS and Ukraine and stuff like that. There's been pressure on countries to not join this bank, right? And yet a number of them have expressed interest, right? And so we know Algeria has just joined, or has been accepted to join this bank. And Algeria is interesting. One might say, well, why Algeria, right? And here I think Algeria shares with the other banks that are looking to join. It's always good for these emerging market economies to have another source of finance, development finance. Obviously, there are still limits within the MDB family of how much capital can be provided by the MDBs, the World Bank, or other regional development banks. And so for these countries, having another option is always helpful. The NDB doesn't come in with a lot of onerous conditionalities, right, as far as we can tell. So, in that regard, it's kind of, if you want to say respectful or willing to work, flexible, willing to work with the borrower on the terms and conditions of the loans. And so I think that, yeah, like the others who joined, or Egypt and UAE and Bangladesh, they all kind of need the development finance. So that's first thing. So there's real material, tangible need. But the other thing is that I think they all see also that the NDB countries, including China and Brazil and India, they've achieved some developmental successes in the last while, South Africa. And so there are things to be learned from this grouping of the NDB. And they're aware also of geopolitical shifts in the world. And it's not that necessarily these new members want to shift completely, leaving the West behind and joining the BRICS, but it's about counterbalancing or having, multi-alignment or multipolarity. I think everyone recognizes that, or at least these nations, their governments recognize that we are into a much more uncertain world in flux, and where there are more multiple centers of power and influence in the world, and with offering up different models. So I think that as far as a shared agenda, and the other thing too is I have to say, I think there is discomfort out there in the global South and in the emerging market economies in East Asia, South Asia, Africa, Latin America, about the weaponization of the global payment systems, right? And I think that this is something that I hope the G7 wakes up to, that, I understand why they've chosen to, do the sanctions thing. It's, with Ukraine and others and Russia, with regards to the Ukraine war, but it's, you can see, I think, that there is this kind of blowback effect, or boomerang effect, that other countries are looking at it, at the overall scenario and saying, maybe we also need to have some alternative payment systems, alternative, um, tools so that we can maneuver through this world of growing kind of sanctions and weaponization of payments. So I think that these are some of the shared things, Becky. And Algeria is interesting. I didn't realize, like, it's the leading natural gas exporter from Africa, right? I just saw that, and obviously it has ties with China, a lot of ties, like Huawei and ZTE, so 5G, like things are happening. And India has long ties with Algeria as well. And they see all kinds of cooperation opportunities, from pharmaceuticals to infrastructure and all kinds of things. Of course, Russia has ties with Algeria, historical and otherwise. So it's very interesting to look at this. But I also think that probably in the next group of NDB joiners will probably be Malaysia, Thailand, who people are, yeah, because there's talk that they're going to join the BRICS at the upcoming Kazan summit in 2.5 weeks in Russia. Looks like they're going to join the BRICS grouping. And so, yeah, Azerbaijan as well. And so there's the interesting question of, as these countries join the BRICS, does it make sense for them to join the NDB? Right. And, Iran is the one kind of challenging one, among the new members in the BRICS for the NDB to handle, because again, Iran faces a lot of sanctions as well. So, when you're the NDB, you're trying to navigate through sanctions, you might, and as well as credit rating, maintain your credit rating. There's a lot of strategic considerations to think about this way. But yeah, I could see these things happening. And then there's talk, Becky, of in 2 years, Vietnam joining, right? Or even next year, Vietnam and, Cambodia has expressed interest. And, there's always and Turkey. Oh yeah, Turkey's also, there's talk of Turkey joining, at the Kazan. It makes sense that Turkey could join the NDB too, right? And you could see again sanctions. Sorry, Becky.
No, that's a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask you next. We have 4 or 5 minutes left in our talk, and I was really hoping to pivot to think about including you and the GDP Center family of researchers, always try to make sure our work is not only academically grounded, but also relevant to policy decisions that policymakers around the world are struggling with. And you've laid that up so nicely for us. So I'm hoping to end our conversation by thinking about the upcoming BRICS Leaders Summit that's happening at the end of October in Russia, as you mentioned. And I'd love to hear from you. You've mentioned many different countries that might potentially join. You also mentioned earlier something that I'd want to dig into a little bit more with this summit watching question, which is you mentioned the global payment system and the one way that the NDB has innovated and lived up to that word new is be increasing use of, or discussions around increasing use of local currencies. So I'd love to hear from you whether you think either of these things might be awaiting us within the next few weeks, whether we might see continued expansion of membership or continued innovation in what the bank does that might be able to speak to nations, as you say, that want to make sure that they have alternatives in to the current global payment system, ways to be able to navigate an increasingly fragmented world. So all of that in a few minutes. What are you seeing when you look a few weeks into your crystal ball and see what's happening at the end of October?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Becky. I think, yeah, so everyone's kind of watching to see how many new members or whether new members will be added. And Russia has enormous incentive, in order to avoid diplomatic isolation, to try to increase the membership of BRICS. And China's been backing membership expansion. The challenge tends to be India. And because the Indians aren't sure what it all means, each time you bring in a new member, does it strengthen China or others much more? So India's always kind of thinking it through that way. What does it mean for India's influence within the BRICS? And so, but I think we're all watching, and the Russians have put out a number, and so did the South Africans. So something like 34 countries have expressed interest in joining the BRICS. It's incredible. Yeah, I don't know how, like, I don't see 34 joining. I mean, that would be really remarkable, and we'd have to have another podcast to discuss that. It'd be quite a seismic shift in the world. But yeah, I could see 3 or 4 countries joining the BRICS, the ones that we've already mentioned. And then there's the interesting question: what does it mean for the NDB membership? And I think that it would make sense. They have to think that through very quickly. But the other thing too, as you mentioned, is this local currency use. And so already the BRICS have been pushing more and more on using each other's currencies, bilaterally or as a grouping. But the Russians, because of the sanctions, they are highly incentivized to go beyond that and to try to come up with intra-BRICS kind of multilateralized arrangements. And there's talk now of trying to come up with some a BRICS kind of reference currency where they can settle payments of commodities, key commodities, and import-export between themselves in this kind of BRICS reference currency. And Russia has been researching this very heavily. So has Brazil. They've been working together to try to think that through. And then now there's been some reporting that the BRICS grouping, probably led by Russia, they've talked to blockchain, and they're talking about something like some type of BRICS bridge or BRICS, payment platform. Again, this is because wanting to deal with the issue of sanctions, right? And so if they could, so this is digital currency, right? So this would require a pretty significant leap for all of them as far as digital currency. But China is involved in a project headed by the Bank for International Settlements called Project MBridge, and it's multilateral digital central bank digital currency platform already with UAE, Thailand, Hong Kong, China, where they, settled payments for different things, using this multilateralized central bank platform, digital currency platform. So now the BRICS are talking about, do we do this? Again, India is the hard one to convince in all this, because India looks at all this and goes, well, we're not so happy with China, and so how much of this do we want to get involved in? Because how much does this strengthen the international use of the renminbi? But what's so interesting, Becky, is in the last couple of months, if you've noticed, China's foreign minister and the Indian foreign minister, Jai Shankar and Wang Yi, have been meeting, and they're talking about smoothing over relations between India and China. Right now, we'll see how far that goes, because India also is involved in the Quad, and obviously has responded positively to U.S. outreach. So India is always doing this careful balancing thing between BRICS and the West. But it is a bit of a shift. And so people who, like me, who watch this closely wonder, what does this mean? Because the Russians are probably behind the scenes pushing pretty hard on some of these things. So we'll see, will it just be mainly symbolic, as far as local currency and a reference currency, which is still is important symbolism, I believe, because it shows that their central banks and finance ministries will have been talking a lot together. And there's an intention to do more, or will they actually announce something like an intra-BRICS platform for an intra-BRICS currency, which could be used at least to settle payments between themselves? That would be quite something. My sense is they're trying to work towards that, building on top of their increased use of each other's currency and holding of each other's currencies. Right. So that's probably so yeah, those are the things I'm watching for, Becky.
Wow, thank you so much for those guideposts to help the rest of us observe and understand what we'll be seeing in the 2025 BRICS Leaders Summit later this month. And thank you so much for joining us today, Greg, and for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us. And thank you to the audience for joining us as well. To receive updates for future events and research from the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center, you can subscribe to receive newsletters from us at www.bu.edu/GDP.